The smell reached us before the sensors did. That is the detail I keep returning to, even now, 31 years into a career that has seen evacuation corridors choked with bodies and command stations buried under meters of volcanic ejecta. I have stood inside a collapsing pressurized dome on the third moon of Serath and felt the seals pop like broken bones. I have coordinated the departure of 11,000 refugees from a station that had 40 minutes of structural integrity remaining. I thought I had been emptied of surprise long ago. But it was the smell that told me Caldera Station Vane was dying. Sulfur dioxide, thick and bronze-colored where it leaked through the external vents, curling along the underside of docking ring 4 like something alive. My bioluminescent panels along my collar and forearms dimmed almost involuntarily. My body was doing what Thalindri bodies do when confronted with a wrongness too large for language. My junior coordinator, Esvik, pressed 3 of his 6 fingers against my arm. He was young enough that his bioluminescence still ran in the rapid, chattering patterns of a trainee who has not yet learned to suppress his fear signals. Every pulse on his jaw said the same thing in our instinctual dialect. It said, "This is not survivable." "How many are still below?" I asked him. 43 children, he said, age range 6 to 14. They were in the lower school levels when the primary vent gave way. The floor seals on sub-level 3 and 4 are holding, but only just. The navigation signal through the sulfur cloud is completely jammed. I cannot get an automated evac shuttle to enter the approach corridor without a signal lock, and no licensed pilot will fly blind into that. I want you to understand the geography of our crisis, because the mathematics of it still haunt me. Caldera Station Vane was built 42 years ago by the Thalindri Collective as a joint education installation, carved into the interior walls of what our geological surveys had certified as a dormant supervent caldera on the colony world of Tharis 9. The surveys were wrong. They were wrong by a margin that, in retrospect, seems criminal, though the tribunal that followed found no criminal intent, only the particular arrogance of beings who believe that the universe will stay scheduled. The caldera had reactivated along a secondary fissure network that none of our instruments had been positioned to detect. The eruption was not spectacular. It was slow and immense and catastrophic in the specific way that slow, immense things are. Not an explosion, a grinding. The rock beneath sublevel 2 had begun separating from the rock beneath sublevel 3 at a rate of 4 centimeters per hour, and the sulfur dioxide output from the new vents had already exceeded safe atmospheric thresholds in the upper docking rings. Every automated system we had was failing in sequence, navigation beacons jammed, docking ring pressure seals warping from the heat differential. External communication degraded to 30% capacity because the eruption had ionized the upper atmospheric layer above the station in a band that our antennae could not punch through cleanly. The children in sublevels 3 and 4 had no way up that did not go through a corridor now full of sulfur compounds at 8 times the acceptable concentration for Thalindri physiology, and twice the acceptable concentration for our partner species, the Vorkai, whose cultural representatives made up the majority of the station's upper administrative staff. The Vorkai. I should describe them for you. They are tall, crystalline-scaled beings whose scales shift color in response to emotional state, the way our bioluminescence does, though their palette runs colder. Calm is a pale ice-blue shimmer. Authority is white. Anger runs toward deep violet. Fear, in a Vorkai, turns the scales almost black, and in the half-hour since the primary vent had given way, I had watched Commander Yis Varhen, the senior Vorkai administrative officer on Caldera Station Vane, go from white authority to a black I had never seen on a living being. The evacuation is proceeding on the upper levels, he told me, each word carried in the precise formal register that Vorkai used when they were performing composure they did not feel. The children in the sublevels must wait for the sulfur concentration to decrease or for a navigation signal to be re-established. "Commander," I said, "the geological team is projecting a floor separation event in the next 90 to 120 minutes. At the rate the fissure is widening." "I'm aware of the projection, Coordinator Don." "Then you are aware that 90 minutes is not long enough for the sulfur concentration to drop to navigable levels." His scales did not change. That was the worst part. He had already finished the calculation. He had already put 43 children into the category labeled accepted loss, and his scales had gone still and cold, because the Vorkai way of dealing with mathematics you cannot argue with is to become as crystalline on the inside as you are on the outside. "Is there any licensed pilot within range?" he asked. Svik pulled up the manifest. 3 licensed pilots are currently docked or within approach range. Pilot Shenvar, Thalindri Commercial Transport. She is refusing the approach corridor. Pilot Doisrak, Vorkai Emergency Response. He is already committed to the upper ring extraction and cannot be redirected without endangering those passengers, and... He paused. He tilted his head in the way young Thalindri do when they encounter something in a data file that does not fit any of their existing categories. There is a human, a cargo hauler. He has been holding in the pre-approach zone for the last 40 minutes, waiting for docking clearance that I forgot to process because of the emergency. He is on Channel 9. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It was not hope. It was a kind of desperate pragmatism, the willingness to try anything when everything else has been exhausted, the way a drowning creature will grab at floating debris, not because it believes the debris will save it, but because the alternative is to do nothing at all. My opinion of humans at that time was, I confess, neither warm nor particularly considered. I had processed hundreds of human pilots through transit logs over the years. They were, as a species, inconsistent, capable of extraordinary feats in certain narrow domains, prone to inexplicable decisions in others. They were noisy. They filed incomplete manifests. Their ships were frequently modified in ways that made our automated docking systems confused, and they had a cultural habit of being aggressively informal in professional communications that I found grating at the best of times. This was not the best of times. I opened Channel 9. Unidentified cargo vessel in the pre-approach zone. This is Senior Evacuation Coordinator Veskara Dawn of Caldera Station Vane. I need to speak with your pilot immediately. We have a critical emergency situation. There was a brief pause, then a voice came back. It was male, unhurried, carrying the particular acoustic quality of someone eating something while communicating. "Yeah, hey coordinator, this is Mac Calloway on the Henrietta Lou. I figured something was up given that the whole lower atmosphere looks like the inside of a sulfur mine from here. You doing okay over there?" I took a breath. "Mr. Calloway, I will be direct. We have 43 children trapped in the sublevels of this station. The approach corridor is filled with sulfur dioxide at levels that will defeat automated navigation systems. The structural integrity of the sublevels is projected to fail within 90 to 120 minutes. I have no pilots willing to attempt a manual approach through the sulfur cloud. I am asking if you are willing to attempt it." Another pause, shorter this time. "How thick is the sulfur band?" "Oh, thick. Approximately 400 meters of dense cloud, beginning at the 1800-meter mark from the docking ring." "What's the wind shear situation at the caldera rim?" I checked. "Variable, gusting to 60 kilometers per hour in the upper band, decreasing toward the lower ring." "And the docking ring itself, is it still geometrically sound or is it warped?" "Warped," I admitted. "Ring 4, which is the closest viable ring to the sub-level emergency access, is showing a 6-degree tilt off horizontal." There was a silence then that lasted long enough that I began to compose in my mind the language I would use to tell 43 families what had happened to their children. "Okay," said Marcus Calloway. "Here is the thing, coordinator. I used to run gas giant Atmo haulers on the Yevris run. You know that route? You drop into the upper atmosphere of Yevris 3 to skim compressed methane, and the wind shear down there makes your 60 kilometers per hour look like a pleasant breeze. I got pretty good at flying on instruments that were lying to me, because in that kind of atmospheric interference, half your instruments are lying all the time and you have to figure out which half." He paused. "I also used to race modified short-hop shuttles illegally in the Bracken Belt. 6 years of that before I got my cargo license and went legitimate. So I have some experience with warped docking rings. That is not actually the hard part." "Mr. Calloway," I said, and I was aware that my bioluminescence had shifted into a pattern I rarely displayed on duty, a warm amber that meant something close to please. "What is the hard part?" "The hard part," he said, "is that my ship is a cargo hauler, not an evac shuttle. I'm going to need your team to tell me the exact internal layout of the access corridors so I can figure out the best way to get 43 kids onto a ship that is technically rated for 8 passengers. Also, I'm going to need about 10 minutes to modify my approach sensors for atmospheric interference. And I need someone to talk me through the docking ring geometry in real time once I am inside the cloud. Because I cannot see and you are going to be my eyes. What followed defied explanation. Not the flying itself, not yet, but what happened in the minutes before it. Commander Yisvarhen, whose scales had been black with suppressed grief since the moment the fissure projections came in, turned to look at me with an expression I had never seen on a Vorkai face. It was not hope exactly. It was the specific bewilderment of a being who has closed an equation and watched it open again. "He is going to attempt it," Yisvarhen said. It was not a question. "He is going to attempt it," I confirmed. The commander's scales did not return to white. They shifted slowly to a pale and uncertain blue. Alive. Still calculating. No longer finished. I pulled up the station schematics and began feeding Marcus Calloway every measurement we had. The width of the docking approach, the exact angle of Ring 4's tilt, the internal corridor dimensions from sub-level 4 to the emergency cargo access hatch, which was the only entry point large enough for a ship to use without landing. A hatch designed for equipment transfer, not passenger extraction. "That hatch has a manual override if your external power coupling fails," I told him. "But it requires someone on the ground to operate it." "Are there adults down there with the kids?" "2 teachers. Thalindri. They have emergency respirators but limited mobility in the current atmosphere." "Okay, can you patch me through to them?" I did. What followed was a 4-minute conversation between Marcus Calloway and a terrified junior schoolteacher named Fessick, who had been keeping 43 children calm in a sealed classroom for the past hour by, as best I could determine from the audio, leading them in a counting game. Marcus spoke to Fessick in the gentle, unhurried tone that I would later hear him use with the children themselves, giving clear, simple instructions for the hatch override sequence, repeating each step twice, never once using the word emergency or danger or crisis. "You're doing great, Fess," he said, using the shortened name without permission and with complete confidence that it would be accepted. "When I get to the ring, I'm going to make a noise that sounds worse than it is. The ship is going to groan a little on the warped coupling. That is normal. That is just the docking collar adjusting. Tell the kids it is the sound the ship makes when it is saying hello, okay?" Esvik, standing beside me, had gone entirely still. His bioluminescent jaw stripe had locked into a sustained, unblinking gold that in our physiological language means something between wonder and terror. He was 23 years old, and he had never, in his brief professional life, encountered a human who spoke to fear the way Marcus Calloway spoke to it, the way you speak to a nervous animal, calmly and without condescension, acknowledging it without feeding it. I did not know it yet, but I was watching Esvik become someone different, someone who would remember this day for the rest of his career. I would not understand that until much later. The next 40 minutes were agony. Marcus Calloway began his approach run at 14:22 station time. I watched the Henrietta Lou on our external sensors, a battered mid-weight cargo hauler with the particular silhouette of a ship that had been modified, extended, and repaired so many times that it no longer bore much resemblance to its original design schematic. It was, in the technical terminology of the Transit Authority, a mess. In the informal terminology that I was rapidly developing for it, it was a creature that had learned to survive by becoming something new each time it was broken. At 14:24, the Henrietta Lou entered the sulfur cloud. The sensors lost visual. We had only the communications channel and the intermittent position pings that were degrading as the interference deepened. "Okay," said Marcus Calloway's voice, and it was still unhurried, still carrying that infuriating, grounding calm. "Instruments are starting to drift. Wind shear at the rim was bad, but manageable. I am using the gravitational gradient of the caldera walls to triangulate position. That is not actually a technique I learned anywhere official. I want to be clear about that." "Mr. Calloway," I said, and I was aware that my professional composure was fraying at the edges. "Are you telling me that you are improvising your navigation approach?" I am telling you that I am using a technique I developed personally over 6 years of illegal racing in an asteroid belt. Yes, it works. Mostly. I am also going to need you to count me down the last 200 meters to the docking ring based on your position sensors, because mine are going to be essentially useless by the time I am inside the cloud. I counted him down. That is what I did for the next 11 minutes. I watched a signal that was barely a signal move through interference that should have been impassable, and I read him numbers, and he flew on them. 800 meters, 750, 700. At 600 meters, we lost the position ping entirely for 47 seconds. Those 47 seconds are the longest period of my career. I have clocked them in my memory more times than I can count. 47 seconds in which the screen showed nothing, and I knew that somewhere inside a cloud of toxic gas, a human being in a battered cargo ship was flying on dead instruments through zero-visibility atmospheric interference toward a warped and tilting docking ring at the mouth of a dying station. Esvik grabbed my arm. He did not say anything. He just grabbed my arm and held it, the way young beings do when the professional distance collapses and there is nothing left but the animal certainty that you do not want to be alone when something terrible happens. The ping came back at 530 meters. "Still here," said Marcus Calloway. "Sorry about that. Found a pocket of particularly dense interference. 400 meters?" 490, I said. My voice was steadier than I had any right to expect it to be. "Close enough, okay. I can feel the heat differential from the ring now, which actually helps. The caldera is hotter than the surrounding atmosphere, and I can use that to orient." "Talking me down the last 200? I talked him down the last 200 meters. At the 40-meter mark, I heard over the open channel the sound of the Henrietta Lou's docking collar making contact with Ring 4. It was exactly the sound Marcus had described to Fessick. A groan, a protest, the sound of metal accepting a geometry it had not been designed for. Then a clunk, then silence. "Seal is holding," said Marcus Calloway. "Imperfect, but holding. I am pressurizing the coupling. Give me 3 minutes and I will have the access hatch open." I walked at that point from the communications center to the external observation deck on level 1, because I needed to see it with my own eyes and not through a sensor feed. I pressed my face to the transparent aluminium of the viewport and looked down into the sulfur cloud, and I could see barely the shape of the Henrietta Lou locked against the tilted docking ring like something that had chosen to be there through sheer obstinacy. It was the most beautiful, ugly thing I had ever seen. Commander Yisvaran came to stand beside me. His scales were no longer black. They had shifted to something I had no word for, a deep and trembling silver that I had not seen in 3 decades of working with Vorkai administrators. He stood there and said nothing, and I said nothing, and we both watched the ship that should not have been able to get there hold its position against the thermal updrafts from the caldera below. "I have been in this post for 19 years, Yisvaran said finally. "I calculated 4 times that the approach was impossible. My calculations used every variable in our emergency navigation database." He paused. "What variable did I miss?" I did not answer him, because I did not have an answer. Not yet. That understanding would come to me later, in the weeks following, in the long quiet of post-incident review, when I had time to sit with what I had witnessed. The variable Yisvaran had missed was not a technique or a skill set or even a specific piece of knowledge. I will tell you what it was, but not yet. The story is not finished. The hatch opened at 14:47 station time. Word count so far, approximately 3,100 words. When you're ready, say write part 2, and I will complete the story with the emotional peak, the extraction, the resolution, the legacy beat, the final chilling line, and the full YouTube package including 3 title options, a description, and 20 tags. You said write part 2, write part 29 to 12. A.M. Claude responded, part 2. The first child through the hatch was small even by Thalindri standards, a 6-year-old whose bioluminescent markings had gone completely dark, which in our young ones is what happens when fear exceeds the nervous system's capacity to signal it. She was past the stage of crying. She moved through the hatch opening in silence, carried by the teacher Fessick, and I watched on the internal corridor feed as Marcus Calloway caught her with both arms and set her down inside the cargo hold, with the specific care of someone who has handled fragile things in rough conditions for a long time. He crouched to her level. He said something I could not hear over the ambient noise of the ship's systems. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced something small and orange. I later learned it was a piece of dried fruit. A human snack food, common, unremarkable, the kind of thing a cargo pilot keeps in his pocket because long-haul runs between stations leave you hungry at inconvenient hours. He held it out to her. She took it, she looked at it, she looked at him. Her bioluminescence came back on. Faint, uncertain, the pale flicker of a very young child who has not yet decided if the world is safe again. But on. I realized something in that moment that kept me awake for weeks afterward. I had spent my entire career thinking of courage as a large thing, a loud thing, the thing that moves through crisis at volume, that makes decisions in conference rooms and gives orders over command channels. I had never once considered that courage might also look like a piece of dried fruit held out in a dark cargo hold to a frightened child who had gone silent with fear. I was 31 years into my career. I was learning something new. The children came through in groups, guided by Fesic and the second teacher, whose name was Orath, a quieter Thalindri who had, I would later discover, spent the entire preceding hour sitting in the middle of the sealed classroom telling the children that help was coming. Not maybe, not possibly, coming. The absolute conviction in Orath's voice on the audio recording, made under circumstances where no rational being could have been certain help was coming, is something I have thought about many times since. But that is Orath's story, and it belongs to him. The children came through the hatch in ones and twos and small clusters, 37 in the first 12 minutes. Then a problem. Coordinator, Marcus Calloway's voice on the channel, still level, but with something underneath it now, a weight that had not been there before. I have 6 kids still down here, and I'm getting a vibration through the hull that I do not like. That fissure is moving. I checked the geological feed. He was right. The separation rate had increased from 4 centimeters per hour to 11. The floor seal on sublevel 3 was showing stress fractures. How long, he asked. Our current estimate is 22 to 30 minutes before the floor gives. And I need about 18 minutes to get these 6 kids through the hatch and get the ship undocked from a warped ring in a sulfur cloud I cannot see through. A pause. So that is fine, that is fine. Fess, how are we doing on the last group? Fesic's voice came back strained. The corridor between 4 and 3 is filling. I can get 4 through in the next few minutes, but 2 of the children cannot walk. 1 has a respiratory reaction to the sulfur exposure, and 1 twisted an ankle on debris. Okay, said Marcus. Okay, send me the 4 who can walk. Send them now and then stay with the 2. I am coming to you. There was a silence on Fesic's end. Mr. Calloway, Fesic said, the corridor sulfur concentration is at 4 times safe exposure limit. You would need a full sealed suit to survive more than a few minutes in it. Yeah, said Marcus Calloway. Does your station have a portable emergency respirator that works at 4 times safe exposure limit? We have emergency rebreather units rated for twice safe limit. They are designed for short evacuations. How short? 8 to 12 minutes of safe operation. After that, the filter degrades. Great. That is plenty of time. Where are they? Esvik made a sound beside me. A small involuntary sound that I have no clinical name for. It was the sound a young professional makes when they witness something that will change how they understand the word professional for the rest of their life. Commander Yis Varhen, who had returned to the communications center and was standing at my shoulder, said nothing. His scales had gone to a color I was beginning to understand was specific to this situation. Not silver, not blue. Something between them. The color of a Vorkai who is watching a thing they calculated was impossible, and revising in real time everything they thought they knew about the calculus of impossible. What followed defied explanation, and I say that as someone who has written 12 official incident reports in my career and used the phrase never once because official reports do not accommodate defiance of explanation. I will use it here because this account is not official. It is personal. It is the account I give at the annual Transit Coordinators Symposium. Now, when the younger coordinators ask me what the most significant incident of my career was, I give it carefully. I give it completely. And then I tell them what it means, which is a separate thing from what it was. Marcus Calloway put on an emergency rebreather unit, rated for 8 to 12 minutes, in an atmosphere at twice safe sulfur exposure limit. He then walked into a corridor at 4 times that limit, carrying it on borrowed time from the moment he crossed the threshold. He reached the 2 children in 4 minutes. I know this because I was watching the biosensor data from the rebreather unit, which transmitted a simple signal. I watched the remaining filter capacity drop from 100% to 63% in those 4 minutes, which is a degradation rate that no emergency systems engineer had designed for, because no emergency systems engineer had anticipated a user walking voluntarily into an atmosphere double the unit's rated tolerance. The child with the respiratory reaction was unconscious, not dead, unconscious. Marcus picked her up. The child with the twisted ankle was a Vorkai, approximately 8 years old, whose scales had gone the terrified black of a creature in crisis. She was pressed against the corridor wall, and she was shaking. "Hey," said Marcus Calloway. His voice on the rebreather feed was muffled and slightly distorted, but audible. "Hey, I have got you. What is your name?" The child said something I could not make out clearly. "Vic," said Marcus. "Okay, good name. Vic, I need you to climb onto my back and hold onto my shoulders. Can you do that for me?" A pause. "My ankle hurts," the child said. "I know," said Marcus. "I know it does. You are being very brave. You do not have to use your ankle. You just have to hold on. You think you can hold on." Another pause. Then, on the biosensor feed, the filter capacity went from 63% to 41%. 22 percentage points of filter consumed in the time it took an 8-year-old Vorkai child to decide to trust a human she had never met. She held on. Marcus Calloway carried an unconscious child and an 8-year-old clinging to his back through a sulfur-saturated corridor that was actively degrading his rebreather filter at more than twice its designed rate. He covered the distance back to the hatch in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I know the time because the biosensor feed was still transmitting when he came through the hatch, and the filter capacity at that point read 4%. 4%. He set the unconscious child down on the cargo hold floor with the same careful practiced movement I had seen him use with the first child, the one whose bioluminescence had gone dark. Then he reached back and helped the Vorkai child, Vic, down from his shoulders, and he stood up, and he pulled the rebreather off his face, and he took 3 very large, deliberate breaths of the Henrietta Lou's internal atmosphere. "Right," he said, to no one in particular. "That was a bit tight." Esvik fainted. "I want to record that officially. My junior coordinator, Esvik, who was 23 years old and had been holding himself together through 40 minutes of crisis with a professionalism that exceeded his years, heard Marcus Calloway describe surviving 4% filter capacity in double-limit sulfur exposure as a bit tight, and he fainted. He went down slowly, the way tall beings do, his bioluminescence cycling through every color in our physiological vocabulary in rapid succession before going to a flat unconscious white. Gees Varen caught him. I do not know if that was an instinct or a decision. I suspect even the commander does not know. "Coordinator," said Marcus Calloway from inside the Henrietta Lou, "I need to get this ship undocked and out of the cloud. We have a Fisher event incoming, and I would prefer not to be attached to the station when it happens. Can you talk me out the same way you talked me in?" "Yes," I said. "Yes, stand by." The undocking took 6 minutes. The Henrietta Lou groaned its way off the warped Ring 4, and I counted Marcus out through the cloud in reverse, and the position ping dropped at 340 meters and came back at 200 meters, and then at 100 meters his visual sensors cleared the sulfur band, and I heard him make a sound that was not words. A small sound. The kind of sound a person makes when they see something they were not certain they would see again. Blue sky, the open atmosphere above Tharis 9, thin and cold and completely, magnificently clear. "Out," he said. "All 43 accounted for." I checked with Fesic, with Orath. I counted the biosignatures on the cargo hold feed. "All 43, I said. "Good," said Marcus Calloway. "Good. I am going to need to find somewhere to set down that is not an active volcanic caldera. Any suggestions? Within hours, the story had reached the Thalindri Collective's Emergency Coordination Network. By the next day, it had passed through every major transit hub in the sector. Within the week, it had been discussed in 3 separate diplomatic channels that I am technically not cleared to name but that I can confirm exist. The floor of Sub-Level 3 separated from Sub-Level 4 8 minutes after the Henrietta Lou cleared the docking ring. The caldera produced its largest surface event 14 hours later. Caldera Station Ven is a sealed site now. There is a marker on it. I have not visited it. I may one day. What I did not anticipate, and what I want to record carefully here, is what happened when Marcus Calloway landed the Henrietta Lou at the emergency field station we had established 12 kilometers from the caldera at a site with stable geology, and the 43 children came down the cargo ramp into the afternoon light of Tharis 9. Fairsick, who had recovered, was first down the ramp, then Orath. Then the children in a stream, some carried, some walking, some running, their bioluminescence and scale color a riot of relief and exhaustion and the particular brightness that very young beings produce when danger has passed, and they do not yet fully understand what danger was. Marcus Calloway came down the ramp last. He was carrying the Vorkai child, Vic, whose ankle had swollen during the evacuation. He set her down gently at the base of the ramp, where the medical team was waiting, and he said something to her I was close enough to hear. "You held on the whole way," he said. "I noticed that." The child looked at him. Her scales were the pale, exhausted silver of a Vorkai who has used every emotional resource they possess. Then she did something I had never seen a Vorkai child do to a non-Vorkai adult. She put both of her hands around one of his and held it for a moment, the way their kind do among family. Then the medical team took her, gently, and Marcus Calloway stood at the bottom of the ramp with his hands at his sides, and Commander Yisvarhen walked across the field toward him, and I followed because I did not want to miss what happened next. Yisvarhen stopped 2 meters from Marcus Calloway. His scales were white, full authority white. But it was not the white of administration or command. It was the white of something formal and old in Vorkai culture, a color worn at what they call moments of debt, too large for language, which is their species' way of describing an obligation that cannot be repaid and therefore must simply be acknowledged. "Marcus Calloway," said Commander Yisvarhen. He used the full name, both words, which in Vorkai formal culture signals that a being is being addressed as a complete and singular individual, not as a role or a function. "On behalf of the Vorkai administrative presence on Caldera Station Vane, and on behalf of the families whose children you carried out of that corridor, I am formally requesting to know what we owe you." Marcus Calloway looked at the commander for a moment. He pushed his hair out of his face. He looked down at the ground and then back up. "Nothing," he said. "I was already there. Docking clearance would be nice eventually. I still have not technically cleared customs, but I am not in a rush." Yisvarhen's scales shifted. A complex movement, many colors at once. The Vorkai equivalent of a being who is trying to contain something too large for a single emotional register. "That is not an acceptable answer," the commander said. "Okay," said Marcus. "How about this? Your people built a school in a volcano. Maybe build the next one somewhere geologically quieter. I would consider that a fair outcome." He smiled. It was a tired smile, and a genuine one, and it reached his eyes. And it was the most human thing I had seen him do in 3 hours of watching him do impossible things. Yisvarhen looked at me. I looked at Yisvarhen. "He is not going to accept a formal commendation, is he?" the commander said. "No," I said. "I do not believe he is. I do not." Within the week, the Thalindri Collective's emergency navigation protocols were under full review. The assumption that atmospheric interference above a calculated threshold constituted an impassable barrier for manual piloting was quietly removed from 4 separate operational documents. It was not announced. It was simply changed. I noticed because I was on the review committee and I watched it happen. The Vorkai Administrative Council passed a formal resolution of gratitude addressed to the human cargo hauler Marcus Calloway, which was the first such resolution they had issued to a non-Vorkai individual since the settlement of the Tharis system 40 years prior. Marcus Calloway, I was told, responded to the notification with a brief message thanking them for the gesture and noting that he hoped the children were doing well. He then filed a corrected customs declaration for his original cargo, which had been sitting in the Henrietta Lou's hold throughout the entire event, and which turned out to be, anticlimactically, a shipment of industrial water filtration components. He was gone within 36 hours. Another run, another route. The transit logs show the Henrietta Lou departing Tharis 9 on a cargo contract to a system I am not familiar with, carrying something I do not remember and did not pay close attention to because it did not matter. He was already somewhere else, moving on, the way that species moves. I saw SVIC 6 months later at a transit coordination symposium on the collective's inner ring. He had put in for a specialist certification in high-interference manual approach protocols. It was a certification program that before the events at Caldera Station Vane had been attended primarily by military pilots and emergency response specialists. SVIC was, at the time I spoke to him, one of 3 civilian transit coordinators who had enrolled. He told me that he had begun corresponding with Marcus Calloway, not formally, casually, the way humans correspond informally at irregular intervals, apparently about nothing in particular and apparently about everything. He told me something, SVIC said, and his bioluminescence was doing the sustained certain gold I remembered from the cargo hold corridor, not the frantic fear gold, but something older and quieter. He said that the reason he can fly in conditions where the instruments fail is that he spent years learning to trust what his body tells him when his instruments lie. He said that the instruments are a model of reality. They are not reality itself, and sometimes reality is only accessible through what you can feel. SVIC paused. I have been thinking about what that means for my work ever since. I told him that I had been thinking about it too. I have been thinking about it ever since the moment I stood at that viewport on level 1 of Caldera Station Vane and watched the Henrietta Lou hold position against a thermal updraft that should have pushed it off the ring. I have been thinking about the variable that Commander Yisvarhen missed, the one that was not in our emergency navigation database. It was not a technique. It was not a skill set. It was not even precisely a piece of knowledge, though knowledge was part of it. The variable Yisvarhen missed was years of being broken and continuing, years of instruments failing and landing anyway, years of flying in conditions that the certified, the cautious, and the sensible had correctly identified as beyond the margin of acceptable risk, and doing it because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was a thing Marcus Calloway apparently did not know how to do. You cannot put years like that in a database. You cannot calculate for them. You cannot, from the outside, look at a battered cargo hauler in a pre-approach holding pattern and see them. They are invisible until the moment they are the only thing standing between 43 children and the floor of a closing caldera, and then they are the only thing that matters. I realized something else that kept me awake for weeks afterward. We had been classifying humans for as long as we had known them. We had categories for them: inconsistent, informal, loud, capable in narrow domains. We had built an entire administrative framework for managing their integration into collective transit systems based on these categories, and the categories were not wrong exactly. They were just tragically, dangerously incomplete. We had looked at them and seen their surface. We had not asked what was underneath it. We had not asked what 30 years of living in conditions at the edge of survivability does to a species that refuses, on what appears to be a fundamental level, to accept that some things are not survivable. I do not know what else they are capable of. That is the honest answer. I have been asked it many times since the events at Caldera Station Vane by officials and administrators and younger coordinators who want me to give them a number, a ceiling, a boundary they can enter into a database and use to build policy around. I cannot give them one. I have worked in emergency transit coordination for 31 years. I have developed over those years a good instinct for what a species is at its core, what they will do when the instruments fail and the corridor fills and the floor is moving beneath them. The Thalindri will signal. We will reach for each other in the dark and we will glow because that is what we are, beings who communicate distress and solidarity through light, who were built for community and fall back on it under pressure. The Vorkai will calculate. They will close their equations and face the result with their scales still and their eyes open, because that is what they are, Beings who believe that if the mathematics is clear enough, the feeling can be managed. And humans. Humans will pick up 2 children in a corridor with 4% filter capacity remaining and walk out calling it a bit tight, and mean it, because to them it was. To them, the margin that felt like the end of the world to everyone watching was simply the margin they had always worked in, the margin they had always called home. The last thing I will record here is this. 3 weeks after the evacuation of Caldera Station Vane, I received a personal message. No official header, no transit authority routing codes, just a sender tag that read M. Calloway, Henrietta Lou, in transit. It said, Coordinator Don, heard the review committee pulled the atmospheric barrier assumption from the manuals. Good call. Hope Esvik is doing well. He seemed like a good kid. Take care of yourselves out there. That was all. No request, no follow-up. He had already moved on before he sent it. The message was a glance backward over a shoulder, nothing more, from a person already pointed at the horizon. I kept it. I am not entirely sure why. I have not kept personal messages from incident parties before, but there is something in that message I return to. The easiness of it. The absence of weight. He had flown into a sulfur cloud on dead instruments and carried children out of a closing caldera and gone home and gone back to work. And 3 weeks later, it was something he was glancing back at, briefly, the way you glance at a difficult stretch of road you have already driven past. I think about what the galaxy looked like before we knew that was possible. I think about how comfortable we had been in that, not knowing, how neatly it fit into our frameworks and our databases and our margins of acceptable risk. We had spent 40 years building a picture of humanity as something manageable, something that could be categorized, integrated, routed through our systems with the appropriate allowances made for their particular quirks. We had welcomed wolves and called them very unusual sheep,